So Eric, would you mind briefly introducing yourself?
Okay, thanks, Paulina. I'm Eric Kansa, and I'm the technology director for Open Context. And that means that I'm primarily responsible for maintaining the Open Context web platform for publishing archaeological data. And so that involves a lot of software and systems administration, keeping the website up. And also, I'm responsible for the processes around ingesting and publishing a lot of the data sets. So those are my main roles, but my background is actually in archaeology, and I worked in the Eastern Mediterranean for the most part, in Egypt and then Israel and Jordan and Turkey, and more recently in Italy also. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from. So it's a sort of mixture of sort of data and web stuff and archaeology. So that's my
Nice.
main professional role. And I also work on a consulting basis for the Getty Conservation Institute as in support of the Arches project, which is open source data management software for the cultural heritage field.
Awesome. So, in a couple of different articles for the sourcing series posted on the AAI news page, which is going
Mm-hmm.
to be linked in the video description, hopefully, we've talked about citation and attribution kind of vaguely in this greater scheme of academic and image crediting. But we felt it
Yeah.
was really important to have a more specific piece on data citation specifically. Um, because data and data sets are created like any other sort of creative work and they should
Yeah.
require attribution and citation. But it seems like at this point, particularly in archaeology and cultural heritage, there's kind of a lack of consensus about exactly how to do it or what that means or why we should do it and all of those sorts of questions.
Right.
We'll get to some of those more interesting questions maybe in a little bit, but I wanted to ask you or start off by asking you, what does it mean to you to cite data?
That's a very good question. Really, a lot of what I think about for citing data, it's really about providing provenance for information. So you want to show where she got some information that you want to discuss. So typically, if you're, and so citing data is really in this sort of world of reusing data that you did not yourself create. So if you're reusing information that is coming from another source, and when we talk about data, it's going to be typically digital. It might be usually structured, meaning that there's some sort of regular logical pattern to that information. So like it could be in rows and columns, like in a spreadsheet or a data table like that. But there are other data structures also. But really what it's about is when you're using this kind of information that is digital and it's going to be repurposed for some thing that you want to work with using data that other people created, you really need to establish the provenance of that information. Where did you get it? And that's important for a whole bunch of reasons that we could probably talk about. But fundamentally, it's about provenance to me.
Nice.
Mhm.
So branching from that, is there a particular reason why you think data citation is important in archaeology specifically? And related to that, are there any sort of discipline specific or discipline unique considerations that you've noticed within archaeologically related or created data that you think that people should consider?
Yeah, also really good questions. I mean, so archaeology is not unique in needing to cite data. So really any field of inquiry, whether you're in the natural sciences or the humanities or the social sciences, uh, providing, or even journalism, providing provenance for information is really important because, so part of that is also establishing trust, building credibility, because where did you get that information? Providing a way to follow where you've acquired information is important because then somebody else could say, well, that's a really interesting data set. I'd like to use it too. And then they can also learn more about the credibility of that information that you're reusing. So it's fundamental to really any kind of field of inquiry. Archaeology you know, it's special in archaeology too because in archaeology we have this sort of really fundamental interpretive lens that we call context, right? So, like, we don't only look at objects or artifacts or whatever in isolation, typically. We want to understand patterns in where they come from, the specific deposits, the sites, the features, all of these other kinds of related information. And some of that is archaeological context, like the stuff you see in dirt and stratigraphic relations and things like that. But context is also really broad. It's also about method and theory. What are the research questions? What are the big debates and discussions in the discipline? And context also really touches upon people and communities too, descendant communities, maybe indigenous communities whose have deep ties with the landscape and with archaeological remains within their ancestral territories. So all of these different kinds of contexts are related with what ultimately gets sometimes described as digital data. And data citation and citing that helps establish that linkage between the information that you're working with and these much broader sorts of communities, bodies of knowledge, questions, and other information sources. So it's about keeping the sort of like those conversational links within information and not disassociating information from those connections.
Nice. Yeah. So, I guess building from that, are there specific methods for citation and attribution that you draw from when you start to consider the possibility of establishing something like a data citation or data attribution protocol in archaeology?
Yeah, and this is where things get a little bit into the world of technology and data infrastructure and things like that. And it's all of these things are evolving constantly. And so, what we say now is likely, hopefully, going to be improved upon and superseded in the future as we learn more and we learn more about how to do things in a sustainable kind of a way. So there's really right now, data citation is hard. And the reason is that, as we all know, information that's shared typically on the internet is through the World Wide Web, that part of the internet that has, that you use through the browser, basically. And you're all familiar with following links that are broken, right? So those broken hyperlinks is a problem, and those hyperlinks are fundamentally kind of like one of the ways that you would want to reference or cite a data source. And if those links break, then it breaks that citation, it breaks that sort of connection and that trust. So where things have gone, people have recognized this for a long time. People who are care about the internet, care about the World Wide Web, especially people in digital libraries, they've been developing types of infrastructure that try to reduce the number of broken links that you would encounter when you're citing data. And those infrastructure are provide something called persistent identifiers as services. And persistence is what you'd want for these identifiers because you want them to last. And because there are persistent identifiers for the web, so these are meant to be ways in which that you can identify something on the World Wide Web and also retrieve it. So it's both an identity and an address for information. And if those are persistent, then you can identify something and retrieve it. And that's really the sort of fundamental basis of creating a trustworthy system for citation of information over a long period of time. So the best sort of thing that I would suggest around all this is, as much as possible, try to find information sources that have those kinds of levels of trust, levels of commitment in them that are through those persistent identifier kinds of services.
Nice. I guess could you give us an example of one of those sort of persistent identifier services, just for folks who might not be familiar with what you mean by that?
Yeah. So people who are like in academics are probably familiar with something called a DOI, which is a document object identifier. And that's a type of persistent identifier. And lots of digital repositories that store data, including storing archaeological data, use DOIs, document object identifiers, as persistent identifiers for data sets. And so that's one example. So if you go to a repository like the Archaeology Data Service in the UK, you could go to TDAR, you can go to Open Context, you can go to more general repositories such as Zenodo, and you'll see a lot of the contributions, the submissions in those repositories will have DOIs associated with them. And those DOIs will be the kinds of things that you will include in a citation. DOIs are not the only type of persistent identifier. There is something else called an ARK, which stands for Archival Resource Key. And those are used often maybe with, say, some museum collections. So the Smithsonian uses ARK identifiers. The Louvre uses them. And ARK identifiers are used in a lot of other information systems too. So Open Context, when we publish data, we also use ARK identifiers for very specific kinds of things. But both DOIs and ARKs are types of persistent identifiers. There's a
Nice.
few others too.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's a really great
Mhm.
introduction to what those mean. Kind of related to making sure that you want to link through persistent identifiers, as typically academic archaeologists in certain ways.
Mhm.
When I think a lot of archaeologists think about citation, they think about the things that come at the end of journal articles.
Right.
I was wondering if there were any current academic archaeology-oriented journals that you think have really good protocols for data citation, or if you've been in on any conversations when people have talked about incorporating data citation into the traditional publication process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it touches on some important issues also of incentives and things. So one of the areas where researchers, including archaeologists, may be sometimes reluctant to share data is that they want to be credited for their hard work and their labor, which is absolutely reasonable. And the more that we can encourage good citation practices to be able to cite data sets, that encourages recognition and rewards for people's data contributions. So encouraging data citation is a really important type of thing. So there are guidelines for different journals that will include referencing and citing data sets. So the Society for American Archaeology actually has these guidelines in their own publications program. So if you publish with an SAA journal, they will encourage you to appropriately cite data sets that you're going to be discussing. Other journals have similar kinds of guidance. Along with Sarah Witcher-Kansa, I'm one of the co-chairs of the publications committee for the American Society for Overseas Research, which is a professional society that includes a lot of researchers, archaeologists, epigraphers, and other scholars who work in Southwest Asia and Mediterranean areas. And we're coming up with similar guidance for the journals that are being published by that society. So yeah, so these there are good guidance on these things. The question is, how much do authors and editors actually pay attention to it, and peer reviewers? But this is one of the really valuable things about what you're doing with this conversation, Paulina, too. It's just that I think the more people are aware of these kinds of things, then they can start looking for that when they start doing things like peer review, checking to make sure that is this data set actually being credited properly.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. And I hope that more people start to think about this as part of their normal academic process when writing and submitting articles, but also when they're reviewing articles that come across their desk.
Yeah.
Because without that peer support, things like this won't change. Related to this, though, is how specific do you feel like folks need to get when they cite data? Part of the inspiration for this video, when we were talking with Dr. Sarah Witcher-Kansa previously about this topic was, is it like you citing the editors for an edited volume, or do you cite the specific chapter from that edited volume? Like how
Yeah.
specific, do you cite the specific book or page number, or how specific do people need to get when it comes to data citation in your view? Or kind of related to that, where are we going as far as the trend for data citation? Like more
Oh,
spe
those are,
less
yeah.
specific, that sort of thing. I guess it's a couple different things, but
Yeah, those are really good questions again. Yeah, so how specific to get is an interesting challenge, partially because, and a lot of it's going to be, unfortunately, the cop out answer, it depends. So, um, different systems have different kinds of specificity at which they will support data citation and persistent identification of things. So, and there are good reasons for that, because supporting specific data citation has its costs associated with it too. So every identifier that is created for every persistent identifier that's created and is being uh, uh, shared and used as a sort of in a suggested citation, like in a digital repository. So if you go to TDAR, they'll have like a DOI and they'll give you some information about how to cite a resource in TDAR. One of the issues with that is there's costs associated with that because TDAR is making an institutional commitment that it's going to sustain the resolution of that resource over a long period of time. Right. So they're making a commitment to say that, look, we're publishing this here. It's available. This is the citation. We're giving a commitment that we're going to do our absolute best to make sure that that's going to be available at this address with this persistent identifier as long as we can do it. So there's costs associated with that. And what happens, because there's costs associated with it, different institutions, different organizations who maintain data that are on the web, who are sharing data on the web, either through digital repositories or a publishing service like Open Context, they make different decisions about how granular they're going to guarantee citation. So, so for some resources, like a conventional digital repository, like TDAR, like the Archaeology Data Service, like Zenodo, you get a DOI, but that DOI will be for typically a file or maybe even a collection of files, right, that you find at that data resource. Now that DOI for a file, that file itself might have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of records within it. So if you wanted to cite a specific record within that, there's no real clear way to do that. So that's a limitation of providing a DOI for a file. Open Context is a different kind of a thing, and Open Context isn't unique in this. There are other information services that also provide very granular information. We provide specific persistent identifiers for very specific things like an individual potsherd or a bone or an archaeological context or a site. And we typically give an ARC identifier for those. And we're making an institutional commitment that we will sustain the accessibility of that resource and that and of the site. We will respect the citation of those resources. But because of the extra costs that are involved, we publish and we have less data than, say, a big repository. So overall, we'll have fewer records, but we have a lot more persistent identifiers because we give it for every record, not just for at the level of a file. So it really just is a sort of like there are these different trade-offs. And I want to highlight that there are these trade-offs, that there's not like one right answer, one wrong answer, you know, we're doing better than them or whatever. It's really just that there are different kinds of decisions that people make when they're trying to figure out how to make information available and how to make it citable.
Yeah, no, I think that that is a really great point, that there's a wide variety of ways to cite data, and particularly at different levels. I always come back to this reminder that almost every academic journal, although it might be based on the same format, has these slight little tweaks of commas and periods,
Oh yeah.
that make each academic citation in each journal you submit to different. And
Hmm.
we all spend lots of time trying to just format our citations for the appropriate journal, even though it might be based on a similar system.
Right.
Um, you also mentioned this in your answer just now about wanting to cite a specific item within a digital document that might have a DOI, but that specific item doesn't have a very unique identifier. And I think about that in relation to trying to quote a specific sentence in an article.
Yeah.
You can't quite get the line, but you can get something like a page number. In your view, when the document you're pointing to isn't just like a report where it has a page number you can cite, when it might be like a line of something in a posted data set that has a DOI, what would be, in your mind, the equivalent of something like a page number?
No, that's a really good point. And it's really hard because
And I would all preface this by I understand that the answer is probably it depends, but
yeah.
I think that talking about some options might give people ideas about why they should choose to do that or not, and just some options for people to start thinking about.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the weird things. It's really one of the weird and interesting things about data too, in that people often, when they want to reuse a data set, do so, the reuses patterns and the motivations and the sort of methods of reuse are different for data than they might be for narrative, like an article, where so when you want to reference a specific sentence to show where you pulled that quote, say, you could, provide say a DOI to an article plus a page number, and then somebody could figure out where in that page that sentence came from, and that's sort of good enough. Data is interesting. You could sort of do somewhat similar things with a data set too. So like a lot of times, like a data set, say imagine a giant spreadsheet, like a giant data table describing pottery. Each one of the sherds might have an identifier within that data set. And you could say, I'm citing the decoration on sherd 5033 and out of 50,000 sherds. So if you want to talk about one thing, you could sort of do it that way to provide like in that sense, you're using a local identifier. So it's local to that data set, but you're also providing the context where that local identifier is found, which would be, say, a DOI to that data set. And so you could, when you're trying to provide a very specific citation to a specific record within a data set, that's sort of the way you would go about it, is to try to combine that sort of globally unique identifier, the persistent identifier, which is, there's only one DOI for the entire thing in the whole wide world. It's going to point to that one data set. But imagine the specific sherd, there might be multiple sherds, 5,322. I don't know what number I chose, but anyway. So another data set might have its own sherd, 5,322. So if you provide the DOI to the specific data set and then the local identifier within that data set, then you can provide sort of breadcrumbs for people to follow to get back to that original source. The funny thing about data, though, is that sometimes you're not just wanting to cite one specific thing, but you want to cite a whole bunch of things, but not the entire thing, right? You might want to cite a filtered subset of the data. Like if you want to go back to that sherd data set, I want to pull out the information on jars, but I'm going to ignore the bowls. So then that's another sort of an interesting case. And, a lot of times we probably don't have really good ways of establishing that to be able to cite directly. So one option could be like, well, you've taken that data set that has all bowls and the jars and other kinds of pottery forms. You just want to look at jars, and you do a query on it, and you get just the jars. And it's a sort of subset of that bigger data set. And then maybe what you could do is put that subset, publish it, put it into a repository, and then reference to say, look, I'm citing this other person who did all that work in the pottery analysis, but I'm sampling their work, and maybe I'm combining it with data from other sources too. And so essentially you're creating a new data set that will have its own citations. And what's going to be your responsibility in that case is for all those records that you got information for, you need to point back to where the original source was. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing for data, but it really does show you when you're reusing information how seriously you have to consider things like citation issues. It's really got to be kind of baked into the way you're organizing your information.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think that the idea of creating a subset of someone's data is something that's super valuable for being able to share data online, but also really runs up against some of the issues about incentivizing data sharing
Yeah.
because the ongoing, whether it's a real or not real boogeyman in academic work is being scooped. Having your ideas and your work being taken by someone else and used without acknowledging you. And so figuring out good practices for that is really important. I also wonder if some way to do something like cite the query that you used might be another way to do that as a kind of stepping stone between that kind of subset data creation as well.
Right. Yeah, and that's where the world of things like reproducible research comes in really valuable. And in that community, they are building sort of frameworks, kind of methods and expectations and good practices around those kinds of questions, especially because data are often transformed in some sort of a way when you reuse it. In those transformations, change the data set. So you go from original data sets to some transformed data, and often those transformations involve combining information from multiple sources. So you have to track all of those citations, provide provenance and links to that. But all those sort of steps along the way could involve really complicated kinds of queries and other kinds of processing, right? So like you might have really elaborate sort of statistical models or something that you're applying. And what the world of reproducible research tries to encourage would be the code that you use to do all those transformations, all that processing, make that available also so that the data and the code are all there, they're all visible. And when you do that, you also start creating those sort of documentation links to be able to provide that provenance of where the information is coming from, how it gets processed, and what is the final outcome of that processing. And so those are all really valuable kinds of practices. And again, the more that citation is practiced in these using these persistent identifiers, the easier it is to be able to establish, provide people with credit at every step of the way, and that's really kind of fundamental to trying to encourage this sort of collaboration. Because essentially, this is citation is really also about encouraging that kind of collaboration. That you're providing information to a wider community. Community is in turn providing you with recognition. So that's the closing the loop of that. And so that's the sort of give and take, and the sort of social contract of how research is supposed to be conducted.
Yeah, that really reminds me of what the spirit of copyright law is supposed to be, is that to guarantee that someone who created a thing is able to benefit from it, but also to inspire new works and new
Right.
creativity. endeavors. And I think that particularly with data, finding that line between what's just a minor adaptation versus a transformative work from that. And I know some of the other articles that we'll be sharing in the sourcing series touch a little bit on that. And I know that Creative Commons for their images, their recommended recommendations for attribution kind of give some examples of what's the difference between, oh, I just cropped this
Yeah,
versus something that's actually a transformative work and can be viewed as based on something with a certain license, but is now its own thing.
yeah,
Um, and those are really great guidelines. Did you?
yeah. No, I think those are really important, and I think, and really, this is a lot of the sort of conversation is, even if something is not copyrighted, say like you find a public domain data set, good citation practices should still apply because we still care about things like provenance, and we still care about providing credit, even if that credit isn't backed by the force of law. Right. So I think that in this, and that's also kind of where a lot of things like uh, 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 recognition of different kinds of communities and descendant communities is also important. There's not necessarily a lot of legal protections, especially around, say, traditionist or indigenous knowledge, because legally, the sort of Western colonialist legal institutions are going to define, well, that's all public domain. So it's like free, law free, basically. There's property rights free. That doesn't mean it's ethical for you to sort of go about and treating it that way. So I think that the thinking about like who's affected, the communities, what sort of community you want to construct, what are the what are your values, and trying to encourage rewards for you want people to do well by doing right, and so those are the kinds of norms that we want to try to shape in this space, even if the law is going to take a while to catch up, if it ever does. So really, I think that that's one of the really important things is just to create really good positive social norms in this space, because legal protections are there and they're absent. They're hard to enforce unless you're like Disney, you know. So it's a lot of so I think that we have a lot of work to do to have conversations like this and to sort of think about what are the norms that we think are going to be really positive to have the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, that's a really great point. As we kind of seem to be wrapping up some of these ideas, what's one concrete step that you think that archaeologists or people in general can start to take to implement data citation into their practice and research? And where are some places that you might point them to learn more about the practices of data citation?
Yeah. Again, really good questions. So I think even when you're creating data, that's the place to start thinking about citing other data sets. And one thing about one of the beautiful things about data citation is that it helps build context for the information that you're thinking that you're creating. So when you start thinking about citing, then you start looking at other people's data, and then you start seeing, oh, this is a really interesting idea. This is a great way to describe things. It's a great way to organize things. And it provides you some examples of practices that you think are really valuable and that helps you learn. It also allows you to start thinking, oh, I can connect this information that I'm creating with this other information, and those connections could be really informative and interesting too. So it's there's a lot of really valuable things to sort of start thinking about it, even while you're planning and creating your own information, your own data sets. Some things that you might not think of as actually as data citation, but are actually a kind of data citation is when you use reused concepts that are curated by experts in a specific area. So there are lots of data sources on the web that people put a lot of work into publishing and trying to improve the quality and to make available for you to reuse. So there are things like gazetteers. Gazetteer is basically a dictionary of places. It provides names and place information, some history about places. So like if you work in the Mediterranean world, an important one is called Pleiades, but there are gazetteers around everywhere around the world. There's another one called Geonames. And if you have places in the data set that you're creating, you can start linking to those gazetteer resources. And when you do that, then those gazetteer resources might say, well, there's population. Here's information about like when the city was founded. Here's information about these are the different names in multiple languages about this, about what this place is called. All of that, when you start doing those, creating those connections, then you make those connections of that information that is curated by those other experts easier to bring in and connect it and enhance your own information. So those are some of the really valuable things to think about. So really, I think it's just imagining what your data is like, not just to sort of answer your own specific immediate research needs, your immediate questions, but also just to think, how is this information that I'm creating going to be in conversation with much wider communities? So that's basically why it's so enriching, and why things like data citation is not just a very nerdy topic about DOIs and ARCs and stuff like that, but it's much more of a fundamental kind of a thing about like, how am I making a contribution that is connected and relevant to the rest of my community?
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thinking about data citation not as just a technical pursuit or a checklist, but as something that's about continuing this existing conversation and kind of concretizing it,
Mm-hmm.
so that we are very explicit about how our data is related to other people's data or how it came from those data sets. And then also, I love the idea that just exploring existing data sets might be a great way to learn about this process because it just
Yeah.
gives you a great chance to explore what's already there, see what people are doing. Because I do think that sometimes the way that we are able to develop best practices is just by seeing what people are doing and trying to kind of, even if it's just on your own, standardizing it a little bit, copying people so that things are a little bit more legible for longer. Because if you follow someone else's method, that means that your process will be slightly more legible to them as well as
Yeah.
legible to you.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you know, and that's it, it, there's a lot to learn from our wider community. That's like we have a lot of really thoughtful and really dedicated people that we work with. And so I think that that's one of the wonderful things about this is that this helps acknowledge that their contributions, and it helps motivate people to do better. So it's a really powerful kind of a tool.
Yeah. So with that, do you have any sort of final thoughts on data citation in theory and practice in archaeology as of 5?
Well, I think, I mean, I just would love to just encourage more of it, and just to get people, and really a lot of it is about awareness. You know, I think a lot of times people don't even consider it, and then when they do, then they go like, oh, how do I do that? And so I think that this conversation that you're having in this sourcing series that you're doing is just so important because it gives people kind of a introduction to why this is important, and some good examples of that I think will be really powerful. It would be really neat over time to watch this unfold and to see what people can do by looking at these connections between information. And I'm sure that there can be really fascinating ways of coming up with new understandings by seeing how people have decided to connect information together, the data sets together. So I think that there's some really interesting opportunities here, in addition to just, it's good ethical practice. So it's good to encourage.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see where this conversation is in even just the next couple of years as various technologies are coming into more regular use by people, both
Mhm.
within academic and outside of academic spheres. You kind of reminded me of the first time that we kind of talked about this in kind of a prototypic way in that SAA session on metadata in archaeology, because that's such a foundational aspect of data citation and having
Mhm.
that present there. But we'll see what happens in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
But I wanted to thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, Eric. I really appreciate all of your insights, and hopefully other people will as well. But have a great day, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate that you focusing so much thoughtful attention on this. So
Yeah, no,
thank
yeah.
you so much. And this has been a wonderful conversation. So really appreciate it.